In the vast frozen wilderness of the forest, a grizzly bear frozen in the snow fights for survival. No strength left, no hope, until one man alone decides to risk everything to save this life. But what happens next will leave you speechless. Get ready to witness a story of courage, sacrifice, and a bond nobody expected. Stay with us to see what it truly means to save a life in the wilderness. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss an emotional story like this one. The morning was cold, and the snow fell relentlessly, blanketing the forest with a thick, silent cover. Daniel, a 36-year-old man, was walking along an isolated trail in the mountains of Montana, where he spent most of his days hunting and fishing. The air was so cold it seemed to cut through the skin, and the sound of Daniel's footsteps, muffled by the snow, was almost the only sound in the vastness of the forest. He knew these trails like the back of his hand, but something felt different that day. The snow seemed thicker, the wind harsher, and the sky, a dense gray mass, felt like an omen of something to come. When Daniel rounded a bend around a rock, something caught his eye. A massive grizzly bear, completely frozen in the snow. The bear was lying down, its head drooping, its fur covered in a thick layer of snow, and there was no sign of movement. Daniel stopped, his heart racing. He knew this wasn't a normal sight. He cautiously approached, his instincts telling him that something was wrong. The bear was there, frozen in place, with its front paws stuck in a thick layer of snow, as if it had been trying to move but simply couldn't. Its eyes were closed, but its breath was weak, indicating that there was still life. He felt a tightness in his chest. Daniel knew a grizzly wouldn't be lying like this unless something was terribly wrong. He had faced harsh winters before, but never had he seen such a vulnerable sight. The wild was never gentle, and bears were strong, independent creatures. But seeing that bear in such a weakened state stirred something inside him. With his heart pounding, Daniel looked around for any sign of help. The bear was in a difficult-to-reach area. The snow was deep, and the uneven terrain made it hard to advance. But he couldn't just walk away and leave this animal to die in the middle of the forest. He had to do something. He knew that time was against him. The bear wasn't getting any younger, and he wasn't sure how long it had been stuck there. It could have been hours or worse, days. Daniel's instincts kicked in. He had to help. With urgency in his every movement, Daniel began to dig with his hands, trying to clear the snow around the bear's paws. His hands froze almost immediately, the cold biting into his skin with every movement, but he couldn't stop. Every second counted. The bear's breathing was shallow, and he could tell the animal was weakening. When he finally managed to free one of its paws, he thought it was too late. The bear wasn't moving, and the lack of response sent a chill through Daniel's spine. But he couldn't stop now. He wasn't going to give up. He had to try. With every ounce of strength, he pushed the bear, trying to stir it. His hands trembling, he continued to pull, push, and coax the bear, willing it to wake up. Suddenly, the bear made a weak movement. Daniel jumped back in surprise. The animal was breathing harder now, and though still weak, it was fighting. It wasn't too late. With renewed determination, Daniel grabbed hold of the bear's jaw and began pulling, using every ounce of his strength to get it out of the snow. The bear groaned softly, but Daniel could see the faintest hint of life in its eye. He wasn't sure how much longer the bear would last, but this was the moment that mattered. In a final burst of effort, Daniel managed to pull the bear free from the thick snow. He collapsed on the ground, exhausted. The bear lying beside him, still cold, but no longer stuck. He stared down at the massive creature, his chest heaving, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel relief. He had done it. He had saved the bear. But what happened next would change everything. Daniel sat there, his body numb from the cold, his breath visible in the frigid air as it rose into the quiet wilderness around him. The grizzly bear, now freed from the snow, was still lying motionless, its body draped in a blanket of snow and ice. Daniel's heart raced as he looked at the animal. It was so massive, so powerful, yet so vulnerable. He had never seen a bear in such a weakened state before. The animal was barely alive, its breathing shallow, its body cold and stiff. Daniel knew he couldn't leave the bear out in the wilderness like this. He needed to get it somewhere safe, somewhere warm, but he had no idea how he would move such a large animal. He was alone in the forest, and he knew it would take all of his strength to try and transport the bear back to his cabin. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the snow-covered landscape. Daniel looked around, his mind racing for a solution. He needed shelter, warmth, and a way to get the bear back to safety. He wasn't sure how long the bear had been stuck, but every minute mattered. The wilderness was unforgiving, and if he didn't act quickly, the bear wouldn't make it through the night. His eyes scanned the area, looking for any sign of help, but there was no one around. It was just him and the bear, two unlikely survivors in the harshest of conditions. Daniel took a deep breath, steeling himself for the task ahead. He had to keep moving. He had to get the bear to safety. Slowly, he approached the bear again. It hadn't moved, but its eyes were open now, flicking toward him, as if it recognized him. Daniel took another step closer, kneeling beside the massive animal, his gloved hands gently brushing against its fur. The bear's body was cold, its once mighty frame shivering with every shallow breath. Daniel could see the exhaustion in its eyes, the fight draining out of it. The thought of leaving the bear here to die was unbearable. Daniel wasn't going to let that happen. He wasn't going to give up. With a determined sigh, Daniel shifted his position, leaning against the bear's massive side. He pushed with all his might, trying to move the animal closer to where he could get a better grip on it. The snow around him was deep, the ground slick and frozen, making every movement more difficult than the last. But Daniel wasn't going to stop. Not now. It took everything he had to finally shift the bear's weight enough to get its legs under it. Daniel grunted with exertion, his arms burning, his breath ragged from the effort. Slowly, the bear began to stir, its massive form shifting in response to Daniel's efforts. It gave a low growl, weak and hoarse, but the sound filled Daniel with a sense of hope. The bear was still alive. Despite the odds, Daniel continued to push, his body shaking from the cold and the physical strain. The bear's legs began to twitch, and it slowly, painfully tried to stand. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest as he watched the bear's massive body struggle against the weight of the snow and its own exhaustion. For a moment, Daniel wasn't sure if the bear would be able to make it, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The wind howled around them, and the snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing everything in sight. Daniel's face was red from the cold, his clothes drenched from his efforts. But he didn't care. He had made a decision. He was going to help this bear no matter what it took. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bear took a tentative step forward. Its massive frame wobbled, and for a moment it seemed like it would collapse back into the snow. But then, with another low grunt, it took another step, and another. Daniel didn't let up. He kept pace with the bear, one hand on its side, guiding it as best as he could. Every movement was a struggle. But the bear was moving now. It was alive, and that was all that mattered. They didn't make it far before the bear stumbled again, its legs giving out from beneath it. Daniel's heart sank, but he didn't hesitate. He was there, pushing with all his strength, keeping the bear from falling back into the snow. It was a delicate balance between hope and exhaustion, but Daniel refused to give up. The night was closing in, the forest growing darker, colder by the minute. Daniel knew he had to get the bear to shelter before the temperature dropped any further. The forest was vast and unforgiving, and he wasn't sure how long either of them could survive out here in the freezing cold. As the hours passed, Daniel and the bear moved at a slow, painstaking pace. The weight of the bear's massive form pressed on Daniel's shoulders, but he pushed forward, his determination never wavering. The sound of the bear's breathing was slow and ragged, but it was still alive. Just as Daniel thought they couldn't go any further, the silhouette of his cabin appeared through the trees. A flicker of light from the window caught his eye. He couldn't believe it. He had made it. They had made it. With one final push, Daniel guided the bear through the door of the cabin, his body shaking from exhaustion. He quickly closed the door behind them, sealing out the harsh wilderness that had almost taken the bear's life. Daniel collapsed to the floor, his body aching, his mind reeling. The bear, now inside the warmth of the cabin, slowly sank to the floor. It was still weak, its body trembling, but it was alive. And for the first time in hours, Daniel allowed himself to relax, taking in the reality that they had survived. But little did he know, what happened next would change everything. Daniel sat on the wooden floor of his cabin, his back against the wall, his eyes never leaving the grizzly bear. The fire crackled softly in the corner, providing warmth against the unrelenting cold that still seemed to linger in the air. His breath, still heavy from the exertion, filled the room with every exhale. The bear, now safely inside, was lying on the floor, its massive body still shaking from the cold. Despite the warmth of the cabin, it hadn't yet regained its strength. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the bear. The animal was huge, its fur matted with snow and ice, but it was alive. He had saved it against all odds. Yet the question that haunted him was still at the forefront of his mind. Would the bear survive? The bear's eyes were closed now, but every shallow breath it took seemed to reassure Daniel that it hadn't given up yet. He didn't know what to do next. Should he stay with it? Should he try to help further? He had never dealt with an animal this large, let alone a grizzly bear, in such a vulnerable state. The fire crackled again, the warmth enveloping the room, but Daniel didn't feel it. His focus was entirely on the bear. He couldn't believe the creature had made it this far, but it was clear that the struggle wasn't over. The bear was still weak, and there was no guarantee it would make it through the night. Daniel ran his hand through his hair, trying to clear his mind, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. He had never imagined his life would lead to this. A man alone in the wilderness, struggling to save a bear from freezing to death. But there was no turning back now. He had made a commitment, and he wasn't about to walk away. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound, a low groan. He looked up to see the bear's eyes slowly opening. They were hazy at first, unfocused, but then they locked onto his. For a brief moment, it felt like time stood still. The bear's gaze was piercing, yet filled with something Daniel couldn't quite understand. It wasn't anger or fear. It was something deeper, something more primal. Daniel instinctively reached out, his hand trembling as he extended it toward the bear. His fingers brushed the bear's massive paw. The bear flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. There was a strange connection in that moment, something unspoken. Daniel had saved the bear, but now it seemed that the bear was acknowledging him. The bond between them had been formed in the most unlikely of ways. The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the bear shifted slightly, its body still weak, but showing signs of life. It wasn't much, but it was enough to reassure Daniel. He sat back against the wall, watching the bear carefully, not wanting to disturb it, but also not wanting to leave it alone. The night passed slowly, the silence broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. Daniel didn't sleep. He couldn't. He watched over the bear, making sure it stayed warm and breathing steadily. Every time the bear shifted or groaned, his heart skipped a beat. But as the hours passed, the bear's breathing grew steadier and its movements less erratic. It wasn't out of danger yet, but it was showing signs of recovery. Morning came, and Daniel was exhausted, his body aching from the strain of the previous day's efforts. The bear had not moved much during the night, but now, in the early light of day, it stirred again. Daniel's eyes shot open, his heart racing. Was the bear finally waking up? Was it ready to try standing? To his relief, the bear lifted its head, its eyes locking onto his again. This time, the bear didn't just gaze at him with exhaustion. It seemed more alert, more aware of its surroundings. It took a slow, deliberate breath before attempting to shift its massive frame. Daniel watched, holding his breath, praying the bear would make it. The bear lifted itself slightly, its muscles trembling, and then it collapsed back to the floor, exhausted. Daniel's heart sank, but he refused to give up. He moved closer, slowly, cautiously. The last thing he wanted was to startle the animal. He knelt beside it, placing his hand gently on its side. "Easy there," Daniel whispered, his voice soft. "You've been through a lot." The bear groaned quietly, its eyes narrowing as if trying to assess the situation. Daniel knew it would take time, but he was ready to wait. After everything the bear had endured, he wasn't going to rush it. Hours passed as the bear rested, and Daniel found himself thinking back to the forest, to the snow, to the moment he had found the bear. He had never expected any of this. He had come to the wilderness to escape the hustle of life, to find peace and solitude. But now, here he was, connected to an animal in a way he hadn't thought possible. As the afternoon wore on, the bear began to move more, testing its legs and shifting its weight. It was slow at first, but each movement seemed more purposeful than the last. Daniel watched in awe, his heart swelling with pride and relief. It wasn't out of the woods yet, but the bear was fighting back. Finally, the bear shifted its weight to its front legs and lifted itself off the ground with a groan. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he watched it, unsure if it could manage to stand. The bear wobbled slightly, but didn't fall. It took a few unsteady steps before finally standing tall, its massive frame towering over Daniel. Daniel stood slowly, his eyes wide with amazement. The bear was standing. It was alive, and as their gazes met, he couldn't help but feel an unspoken bond between them, something forged in the struggle for survival. The bear had fought for its life, and in doing so, it had changed Daniel's life in ways he couldn't yet understand. The bear stood tall, its massive body still trembling from exhaustion, but clearly stronger than before. Daniel couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as he watched the animal. It had been a wild, desperate journey from that moment in the snow to now, standing in front of him, breathing steadily and seemingly more alert. But even as Daniel felt a deep sense of relief, a new weight settled in his chest. The bear's strength was returning, but it wasn't out of danger yet. The forest had been harsh, and though they had both made it through the worst of it, there was still much to consider. The bear was no longer trapped in the snow, but it wasn't fully recovered either, and Daniel knew that soon enough it would need to return to the wild. He didn't want to think about it. The bond that had formed between them over the past day was undeniable. Daniel had risked everything to save the bear, and in return, the bear had fought to survive, relying on him for help. There was something beautiful, something raw about the way nature worked, about the way it tested both the human and animal spirit. But it was becoming clear that the bear needed to be free. It had its own life to live, its own path to follow. Daniel wasn't sure when the realization hit him, but he knew it deep down. The wilderness wasn't a place for domestication, no matter how much he wished to protect the bear. The bear was not meant to stay in the cabin, in the warmth and safety of his home. The bear's gaze flickered over to the window, where the trees outside swayed gently in the wind. Daniel watched, his chest tightening. He knew the animal was still weak, but there was a longing in its eyes that he couldn't ignore. It wanted freedom. It wanted to return to the wilderness, to the life it had once known. And as much as it pained Daniel to think about it, he knew that he had to let it go. Over the next few hours, Daniel gathered what supplies he could. Warm blankets, some food, and a few tools that might help if the bear needed assistance during its journey. But deep down, Daniel knew that this wasn't about supplies. This wasn't about comfort or protection. This was about the bear's survival, about giving it the space to heal and thrive on its own. The bear, meanwhile, had begun moving more easily. It stood on all fours, its powerful frame still slightly shaky, but no longer on the brink of collapse. The fire crackled softly in the cabin, and Daniel knew that it was time. The air outside was cold, but it wasn't enough to stop the bear. He had given it everything he could. Now it was time to return the favor. The bear's eyes met his again, its gaze soft but intense. It didn't move toward Daniel, but there was something in the way it stood, the way it seemed to be looking at him, grateful, but knowing it needed to move on. Daniel took a deep breath and stood up. He wiped his face, feeling the weight of his decision settle heavily on his shoulders. "It's time, old friend," he whispered, though he knew the bear couldn't understand. "You've got this. You've got your freedom." He moved toward the door, opening it slowly. The cold hit him immediately, but he didn't flinch. He knew what had to happen. The bear hesitated for a moment, and then, as if on instinct, it took a slow step forward, moving toward the open door. Daniel watched, his heart heavy. The bear paused just outside the threshold, its body tense as it looked back at him one final time. For a moment, time seemed to stop. There was no sound in the forest, no movement. The bond between man and animal hung in the air, fragile but strong. Then, as if making its decision, the bear took another step, moving away from the cabin and into the snowy wilderness. It walked with purpose, its body strong, its head held high. Daniel stood there watching, his chest tight, but a small sense of peace settling in his heart. The bear was free, and in a way, so was he. He stepped out onto the porch, watching the bear disappear into the trees, its massive form vanishing into the white expanse. For a moment, Daniel stood still, the wind biting at his face, his heart heavy but content. He had done everything he could. The bear had survived because of him, but now it had to survive on its own. As the bear disappeared completely, Daniel turned back toward the cabin. His journey had come to an end. He had saved the bear, but more importantly, he had learned something about himself. The wilderness had tested him, pushed him to his limits, and had shown him the depth of his own humanity. He wasn't just a man in the wilderness anymore, he was part of it. And with that thought, Daniel turned to walk back inside, the door closing softly behind him, the faint sound of the wind outside echoing in the silence of the cabin. The night after the bear had left was one of the longest Daniel had ever experienced. The silence in the cabin felt overwhelming. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that filled the space, but it didn't bring the same warmth it had before. The cabin, once a place of solace and warmth, now felt hollow. There was an emptiness in the air, a space that had once been filled by the presence of the bear. Daniel sat in his chair by the fire, his hands folded together as he stared into the flame. His mind kept drifting back to the bear. He wondered if it would make it through the night, if it was finding food, or if it had already returned to its natural habitat where it belonged. The forest outside the cabin was vast, and the thought of the bear out there alone again brought a sense of uncertainty to his chest. Despite the relief of having helped the bear, Daniel couldn't help but feel a lingering sadness. He had saved the creature's life, yes, but now it was out there, living in the harsh wilderness once more. The very thing he had rescued it from, the deadly cold and the frozen earth, was now part of the bear's world again. Hours passed and the darkness outside thickened. Daniel eventually stood up from his chair, feeling restless. He walked to the window, pushing the curtain aside. The forest was still, the snow falling lightly, a soft blanket covering the landscape. It was beautiful, serene, but it felt like a different world now, one that didn't include the bear. As he stared into the night, Daniel found himself thinking of the bear's strength. Despite everything, being stuck in the snow, freezing, and near death, the bear had fought to survive. It had trusted him, even when it had no reason to. That trust, that fragile bond between them, made Daniel realize just how deeply the wilderness could test a person. It was not just a test of physical strength, but of the heart. The wind howled outside, and Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, listening. It was a sound that seemed to come from everywhere. The deep wild forests, the endless mountains, the very heart of nature. It felt like the wind carried the bear's presence with it. In that moment, Daniel realized that the wilderness had given him something important, something he hadn't known he needed. When he turned back to the cabin, the fire had died down to embers, the warmth now just a memory. He made his way to the small cot where he slept, but he didn't lie down. He sat at the edge of the bed, his thoughts running wild in his head. The events of the past 2 days, rescuing the bear, freeing it from the snow, watching it leave, had shaken him deeply. He wasn't sure why it affected him so much, but he knew that his life, his connection to nature, had been changed forever. He thought about his life before this, about his solitary existence away from the bustle of society. He had come to the wilderness to escape, to find peace and solitude. But what he had discovered here was something far greater. The wilderness was not just a place to hide from the world. It was a place that forced him to face parts of himself he had long ignored. Daniel had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on living independently. He had thought that he could survive on his own without needing anything or anyone. But as he sat there in the dim light of the cabin, he realized that his encounter with the bear had changed that. It had reminded him that no one, no matter how strong or independent, could truly survive alone. The wilderness might offer solitude, but it also offered connection to the land, to the animals, and to the cycles of life that played out in the vast expanse of nature. Just as Daniel's mind began to settle, a sound outside caught his attention. It was faint, a story with someone who could use a little hope today. Let's spread the message of survival, connection, and the power of letting.